Good afternoon, good morning, everyone who's joining. All right, well, I think we still have some people coming in through the waiting room, but we're a minute past, so just for the sake of time, we will go ahead and get started. So just want to say welcome back. Thanks for, I know usually we skip a week, so this probably felt like a quick turnaround for a few of you, but given next week's holiday, this made the most sense. So we really appreciate your time and being here. Quick reminder, we will record this and share the presentation and the slides with you after today's presentation. I should be able to get them out this afternoon. But yeah, we're so excited. I'm gonna pass it on over to Sylvie and let her get us started. We have two really great speakers with us today who've been involved in ROC previously. So looking forward to it and just welcome everyone. And Sylvie, I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Sloan. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good day, good afternoon to all of you. So today we have a great topic about how we support solopreneurs from going from that place of just being on their own to transitioning to being community employers, if that's what they want to do. Probably the hardest thing for a small business owner is getting over that hurdle. And today we have Nestor Torres, who is the managing partner of Myriagon Consulting, and Jean Horstman, who's the founding principal of StepBack Collective. So I'm just going to go ahead and hand it over to Nestor, who's going to be kicking off. And as you guys all know, you can put your questions in the chat. If it's timely, I'll interrupt Nestor or Jean, but if it's can wait, we'll wait till after each of their presentations. So Nestor, over to you.
That'll work. Thank you so much, Sylvie. I appreciate the quick introduction. And overall, ROC cohort, it's a pleasure to be here, and bienvenidos a esta programación, I would say. A little bit about myself and my background, first and foremost. I'm passionate about entrepreneurship, and I'm an entrepreneur advocate through and through. I'm originally from Philadelphia. I'm a Philarican, as I like to say. Pretty much I'm a product of Philadelphia and a product of entrepreneurship. And I use those two hand in hand. Through my journey in my life, entrepreneurship and being introduced into it was allowed for me to take a vocation and take it through a journey of where I'm at today. And so with that, I've been able to have business interests in Philadelphia and throughout, and be able to look at a management consulting firm like Myriagon and be able to deploy it to be able to help underserved markets and emerging markets, and being able to stress entrepreneurial excellence through coaching, advising, and management consulting. And so with that said, I really am thrilled, and the information is like, I can talk about entrepreneurship all day. And the information that I want to try to disseminate to you is really about looking at key basic fundamentals, key things that I think that we can take in our communities and deploy them and look at what's to come in the future and make sure we keep vigilant of what's happening in our landscape, in our communities, and broader economy. So with that said, I'm going to start to share some slides. Let me know if you can't see them. All right, let's see. Can you see the slides? All right, perfect. All right, so let's see here. All right, there we go. And a little technical difficulty. So first and foremost, one of the things that I want to be able to do is look at, from an agenda perspective, the table setting, right? And us talking about, I'm trying to get this into full mode.
If you go on the top, on the orange bar on the top, that little, on the left side, there should be a little like square with a play button in it. Yeah.
Yep. Perfect. All right. Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
There we go. So from an agenda perspective, table setting. So one of the things that I wanted to try to do is look at an understanding of the entity framework. And so I look at all of you as being advocates in this space today. And when you go back to your communities and you look at your partners and your stakeholders, the reality is to be able to advocate from the beginning all the way through to the end. Right. And so part of that process, and especially looking at entrepreneurship, is what that entity framework looks like so that you were able to provide guidance through a structured approach eventually. Then I want to be able to talk about just fundamental common issues that entrepreneurs face from small business and uncovering those, really looking at those hurdles that business owners have. And then finally, kind of putting a framework around kind of the structures and support that can help small businesses go from solopreneurs all the way through to employers in that transitional growth period. So first, understanding the business entity framework. And so when I look at the business entity framework, and it was never told to me, it was like, business is business, right? It doesn't matter. Well, it's not quite that simple from a taxation standpoint, from a legal standpoint. There is differences between different entities in business. So looking at entrepreneurship from solopreneur to employer really takes a path. And that path first starts with really looking at the sole proprietorship. And so that base really looks at there's no barriers to entry. These are the individuals that start at their home, their kitchen, right, their garages. There's no barriers to entry. There's no paperwork really needed. There's no differentiation between the individual and the business. And overall, what they're doing, whether it's a service or a widget, it's a concept overall. That then transitions to what we would call proprietorships. And proprietorships we look at as really now kind of taking that business concept, that idea, and really you've been working through it, or you have capability right from the beginning, and you're able to look at a more formalized approach. That's where an entity creation becomes more apparent. And when I say entity creation, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, we're talking about LLCs or an S Corp or a C Corp, if you will. This entity creation really allows for what we call risk mitigation. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. This organization from a proprietorship standpoint is employee possible. So when you reach this phase, you can absolutely look at the possibility of onboarding employees. There's an asset differentiation in the makeup of the business. And then there's more business-oriented mindset with looking at the business development structure for the future and looking at the growth potential of it. Through that phase, we then transition to what I would call incorporated. And incorporated now is a really more professionalized structure, totally employee capable, has the structure in place to be able to adapt very quickly to market demands. You're compliance ready. There's funding possibilities that can be approached. There's a proof of concept that's been tested from the sole proprietorship aspect and phase where we first started through to kind of really looking at the business development aspects of that and the business model, all the way through saying, yeah, this is a commercializable concept now that we can actually take it through a model and it's sustainable. And that's very important to look at that because this kind of sets the framework for how then we really approach other aspects in programming and putting other structures around small businesses from solopreneur to actual employer. With that process, I bring the trajectory of looking at this as an asset creation model, right? And why do I say that? And so today, when we start looking at the economies of today, entrepreneurship and business development and taking these businesses from small to an entity is actually one of the few ways that minorities or Black and brown communities are able to actually develop assets that are not actually inherited. And so it becomes really kind of a new generation of asset evaluation that becomes crucial of how it's developed and the nurturing of it. to be able to then be utilized further in the wealth process. So continuing on with looking at the functionalities of this sole proprietorship all the way through to the S Corp from an entity perspective. And there's 4 key things that become very instrumental in the functionality of these entities. Okay. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about the 4 areas of limited liability, perpetual existence, ownership transferability, and separate legal entity. These 4 areas are crucial when you start looking at business evolution from a solopreneur to an actual employer and that asset growth potential. So first and foremost, unfortunately, the first 2, the sole proprietorship or the solopreneur and the general partnership aspects of this business evolution really don't allow any limited liability. So what that means is pretty much that something happens, somebody gets sick, somebody's actually, your product or service becomes a hazard to someone else, you get sued as a business owner, but it's really you're an individual. So everything that you have is at stake now to be lost. Perpetual existence is another aspect where the reality is from a solopreneur to an employer, the solopreneur doesn't have the ability to actually have that business live forever, to have perpetual existence as a thing, as a possibility that turns into a legacy. Ownership transferability. This is another area. The first 2, sole proprietorship and general partnerships, they become hard to transfer. If they are not in an evolution state of becoming an entity that has transferability aspects, you can't just hand it over to a family member. You can't just sell it as easily as you think. And the same thing goes for a separate legal entity. The separate legal entity aspect of solopreneur or a general partnership doesn't exist because they can't transact as an entity on its own. And so when we look at this landscape of functionalities of entities, the reality is that from limited liability corporation to C Corp, we start to see the dynamics of some sophistication, some key crucial components in the asset structure evaluation now of the business that allows for flexibility and other things, allows for coverage and being mitigating risk, to being actually now capable of existing for a very long time, if you will. And the 3 that are really key here out of the ones that you see of the entity structures, it's really limited liability corporation, S Corps and C Corps that allow the full functionality across the board of risk mitigation, having potential for perpetual existence, being able to transact and being able to transfer as an asset, as actual wealth, if you will, and being able to transact on its name of its own as an entity, buy and sell as an entity, and transact legally as an entity. And that's very important because that puts it in perspective, if you will. These are undertone, what I would call kind of key evolutionary points when we start to look at solopreneur to employer, because they should take this trajectory. All right. So transitioning, as we look at that, kind of putting that in our backdrop, and now focusing on the challenges that are faced by small business owners, solopreneurs, to even some employer businesses as well. And so I want to try to map that out of what that looks like. So what we do know is that small businesses, especially for Black and brown, and just overall across the United States, are forming at a very high rate, right? And so this formation at a high rate is attributable to several things. And part of that technology, Part of that is need. Part of that is actual opportunities, if you will. But what we also see on the flip side of that is that small businesses and the formation of small businesses are actually also failing at a high rate. And so part of those failures are varied. But overall, what we can see is that within 2 years, small businesses are failing. 50% of small businesses fail. And if you take that out longer to 10 years, about 70% fail. All right. And so those failures come from different aspects. And what I would consider to be the top 6, based off of some market research that was conducted, they start looking at, first and foremost, with the formation of business. One of the things that's not taken into full consideration is the cash, the money, the sustainability to live out first year all the way to 3 years. All right. And that's something when you start looking at the business planning process, solopreneurs, actually, that's not something in the makeup. It just, they're coming out of the gate, they're transacting, it's a product, it's a service that it's real time. And so that thought process in business planning doesn't happen until a bit later as they evolve. The second failure aspect is no market need. So it's actually a service or a product that's being produced that really doesn't have a sustainable market for it. The third is competition. Sometimes as solopreneurs, we think like this is the best idea ever. More than likely, it has been thought about before. There's something similar out there. It's being delivered differently than how you're thinking of delivering it, but it's not the only unique thing in the world. And that's, as a practitioner, as we sit down with our businesses, that's one of the things that we find fascinating is every single solopreneur and even small business owners like, I got the best thing and it's the only thing out there. That's not true. There's always some type of level of competition, some way or an alternative, if you will. The other fourth aspect of challenges is business model. And so along the way, just because a widget can be made or a service delivered doesn't necessarily mean that the mode and in the framework that it's being delivered, it's the best delivery mechanism. And so that's not necessarily evaluated in the start of a business or looking at a sole proprietor and saying, hey, how do you get from A to B? Well, you got to make sure that the business model is able to be flexible, adaptable, and is also appropriate. And then the final two is legal and pricing. So from a challenging perspective, solopreneurs can start, once again, no paperwork. It's no problem. There's really no differentiation. But as you start to evolve, there's a certain legal aspects that start to become into play. Operating agreements, right? Tax structures being formed, filing, making sure you have EIN numbers, making sure you have some of the basic fundamental legal aspects to be able to conduct business where you're at and within your audience and targeted market. And then pricing. This is one of the things that, we struggle with today. And it goes hand in hand with the business model. And so one of the things that we see today is that solopreneurs are really going off of their gut and don't really put all of the necessities of covering what it costs to make their product or what it costs to service their product. And so they really miss out on pricing the product to be able to make the right margins or the right profitability, which then trickles down to other things. So as we look at taking those components, we have a framework of entity, right? And looking at that progression, we have kind of the intricacies of what the challenges are for small businesses in this transition of solopreneur to employer. And part of the strategies that I have looked at in with my colleagues in different markets, in different areas and geographies is really one of, especially today, and as you advocate and look at things, and look at your stakeholders and partnerships. It's really how do we insulate and incubate our small businesses to be able to make this journey. And remember, entrepreneurship is a vocation. It's a continuum of learning, adaptability, applying, if you will. And so that environment has to be one of nurturing. And being able to provide an insulation aspect is very, very important so that the incubation can take place. And so let's look at, first and foremost, what does that mean to insulate for a small business perspective? So when we look at insulation, we really are saying, hey, as partners, as individuals and organizational leaders within the landscape and ecosystems that we're in, first and foremost, we put on the hats of advocacy and empowerment. And that advocacy empowerment is able to, what I would call, take the voice of the small business to another level. And lots of times, small businesses need a voice. More than not, they need the advocacy because they won't be able to do it themselves. They're too worried about being in where they're at today and making the profits or making the sales. And so the peripheral environment becomes not even apparent. And so for us as the advocates and looking at how we partner in the landscape, it becomes very important to make sure that that empowerment happens through an ecosystem approach. And that ecosystem approach is really looking at policies and looking at the environment and how favorable or unfavorable it is to the business development process, from a solopreneur to an employer. And that requires all different stages of detailed aspects and variables to make that journey. And so part specifically that are important to look at insulation is how taxes play an important role across the United States and specifically in certain regions, local cities. And so particularly, we're talking about the net profit tax or how the taxes on sales receipts, for example. So Philadelphia has, for example, a BERT tax that we've been advocating through the Greater Philadelphia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce to actually eliminate that for businesses that make less than $250,000 a year in sales. And the reason for that, it allows flexibility, growth potential, and less of a taxation of a small business that's trying to actually get out of a small business mindset into an employer capable within the ecosystem. And so those aspects become very important to look at what that taxation structure is within that landscape. So for example, in Tennessee, there's no income tax, but sales tax are about 9.3%. Right. And so if you are taxing your sales at 9.3% and you can't really price out your product correctly as a small business, that's a complication. And so being able to look at those intricacies and what that tax implication is for small business and how they develop is very, very important. The second is really looking at incentives. And part of this is really how do we integrate some workforce development aspects into the small business growth from a solopreneur to an employer, and even look at hybrid lending capabilities. So for example, one of the things that certain programs in certain regions roll out is able to provide a development work skill up workforce where the city or another program partner will pay 30% of the actual wages of that individual, for example. And being able to team up small businesses with that skill-based capacity building, it's a win-win. And it can be a win-win to be able to first and foremost allow a solopreneur to be able to take on responsibility of employing now without taking the full scope of financial burden to be able to grow and understand and gain experience from an employment perspective. The other aspect is really looking at what we would call economic opportunity plans within certain programs in municipalities, right? And so part of that, for example, once again, the city of Philadelphia has a program called, they just rolled out the last 4 years, Rebuild. Philadelphia Rebuild program. This is a roughly $400 billion initiative within the city of Philadelphia that is meant to look at infrastructure development and construction for parks, recreational centers, and libraries. And part of the initiative had built in actual capacity building programming for small businesses. And for those who are small, there's a program that was specifically tailored out that was called Rebuild Ready, or Emerging Vendors Program. And so having those incentives, and we look into the landscape and having those built into some of these and advocating that they're there and the right structures can be placed, allow for smaller businesses that may be that one person show to start to get plugged in so that they can start to develop that fundamental business mindset and or concepts to be able to manage their business so that they can make their first hire, second hire, third hire. Finally, when we look at opportunities, looking at inclusivity, looking at hubs and opportunity zones, for example, one of the things as we look at teamwork and looking at the advocacy and being the stakeholders in our communities, there's opportunities that come about from a development perspective of opportunity zones to the actual American Rescue Plan that's being rolled out right now. And those all have different components. So from the bipartisan infrastructure bill to the Build Back Better plan right now that's being discussed, all those have small business components. So right now, the Build Back Better component, they're talking about $25 billion being isolated just for small business development. And so when we start looking at that, how can we be part of that discussion as organizations within the community, as part of the ecosystem, teaming up to be able to be part of that conversation to tailor out programming eventually, or technical assistance that's needed. So what does those partnerships look like overall? Those partnerships pretty much look like small business investment. That's what it's all about. Some of the key areas and takeaways for us to look at is really small businesses need help in affordable rent. That's the reality. Most small businesses that we look at, even starting off from a solopreneur, rents 50 to 60% of their total sales capability. That's unsustainable. It's really, really fundamental. And when you start looking at certain aspects, especially in our communities, especially if we're talking about our main streets, how can we turn these main streets to be able to have affordable rent for our businesses that also have access to ownership? And sometimes when we start looking at small proprietors that are good enough to rent, but not good enough to own, there's an issue. A lot of commercial real estate transactions lock you in for 5 years right from the very beginning. And so having that access to ownership in this conversation becomes very, very instrumental. Also having a local skilled and non-skilled labor necessary, which goes back to that teaming up of that workforce development aspects and utilizing small businesses as on-ramping becomes very, very important. And then finally, the two aspects is really having access to technical and digital parity and business exposure. And the digital and technical parity is today, if we don't have access to quick broadband and information systems as readily and available as our competitors do, and even our bigger businesses do, small businesses are completely at a disadvantage, especially the small solopreneur. And the business exposure is really bringing them into the loop to be able to bring that exposure, that networking capability. So as we transition into looking at the incubation stages, so we talked about the peripheral. Now we're going to kind of narrow it down to some key components to incubate. And when I look at incubation, I look at these are kind of like the triage approach of understanding the key components that require technical assistance in certain of these areas so that we can continue to develop the solopreneur to an actual community employer. And so first and foremost, business owners, we need to differentiate the same way we did between the entity structure. Business owners we categorize into primarily 3 categories. You have your micro business owner, which tends to be your solopreneur. You have your entrepreneurs, which tend to be your more sophisticated business owners. These are employers already. And then you have your professional management businesses. And these are primarily these incorporated businesses that really are, 100 employees, have sometimes even 50 employees. But the level of sophistication and the trajectory from the vocation of entrepreneurship has led them into a level of professional management in their business. And all these 3 areas require tailored approaches to the incubation aspect. And so the first 2 that we'll break out is access to capital and education. And so when we look at access to capital and education from an incubation standpoint, we really talk about tailoring out the subject matter expertise and the topical sessions or workshops to the given audience, especially when it comes to Black and brown businesses. And when we look at Black and brown businesses, especially micro businesses, it's very important for the education components, whether it's formal or informal delivery or structured or unstructured curriculum, that the translation of that business fundamental curriculum is meeting the audience where they're at. And that's very important. If it's not meeting the audience, especially for micro businesses, the solopreneur, where they're at, it's really not an investment, because it's not being translated to the point where they are able to take that knowledge and translate it into their business in an efficient and effective way. When we look at access to capital, it's really the needs of every layer of business in the transition from a solopreneur to an employer, a micro business to a professional management business. It's really different. And those structures and understanding the capital needs becomes paramount. And quite frankly, the needs of the micro business can be met with an understanding of having flexible capital at smaller amounts. And that primarily can be looked at as really looking at how the business planning process plays into the capital structure need and having access to that through what I would say traditional and non-traditional approaches. And so, for example, one of the things that the local chamber, Hispanic Chamber of Commerce has done, we actually took a grant from Home Depot, translated it, and we were able to unrestricted funds into small $5,000 grants to be able to team up with our educational component programming so that they have access to capital, access to the education, meeting them where they're at from a small business perspective. And so that becomes really teaming up the traditional and non-traditional aspects. And then utilizing tangible and non-tangible aspects of the business to be able to leverage. And as you tend to look at asset creation, some of the professional management aspects and entrepreneurs look at and are able to use their intangible assets, which become part of an incorporated aspect, to transact and be able to leverage. And that becomes very, very, very key as an asset and being able to leverage those aspects that today a lot of individuals don't really look at and how that's positioned. And so, once again, I look at our technology businesses of today. They're not built off of widgets. They're built off of actually an intangible asset. And so that's very, very, very interesting that today the value of intangible assets are actually completely upside down compared to the traditional way of valuating assets. And so that's something that from the encouragement standpoint, as we encourage our solopreneurs to meet to employers and look at the business concepts, those concepts actually could be intangible assets that should be guarded. Finally, looking at technical assistance. And so the technical assistance, primarily we break down into 4 components. Programming. So this is peer-to-peer, cohort-based, if you will, delivered either in a classroom or not, but it's programming tailored to the individual audience that whether they're a small business or the actual employer, and what goes into it. And then coaching, advising, and counseling, and what we call consulting. All those mean something different. And in today's marketplace, advising, consulting, and coaching has taken kind of like, they all mean the same, and they're not. They're really not the same. When we look at coaching, is really looking at the ability of provide a guidance to a business, a solopreneur, similar to a mentor, and being able to guide them, not saying that whether they're right or wrong, but giving them that moral support, giving them that encouragement that they can go through this, that they have a support structure. The advising aspect is really of one to start to look analytically at the business model and being able to pair up that business owner with the ability of looking from an evaluation standpoint. And then consulting is really looking at the ability of pairing up businesses to subject matter experts that are able to dissect, determine, discover, and look at recommendations and a possible solution. And the areas that those four components cover is looking at customers and looking at marketing, sales, and advertising, which mean three completely different things. And so today we took marketing, sales, and advertising as one thing. They're not. The short end of it is that when you start looking at marketing from an entrepreneurial perspective, marketing is really the study of the markets and how best from the business model can serve that client or identified client need. Sales is really becoming how do you deliver that product or service, and advertising is really how do you promote it and how you differentiate yourself. And so really understanding that and having the capabilities of having the business owner start to make those differentiations become very important in the phase. And then we look at subject matter expertise, which really deals with accounting, legal, HR, and IT. Optimizing operations. Optimizing operations really starts to detail what is inventory, carrying costs of inventory, production, supply chain, project management, financial capital interpretation, right? What's this cash flow look like? What is that? The analysis behind it. And these businesses need different aspects for the different phase that they may be in. And then finally, looking at planning and strategy. Planning and strategy becomes the integral of all the above to be able to take the business to the next level. And so with that, the critical delivery components of any type of approach or structure, as we look at our frameworks and our ecosystems and you as advocates, what I would ask is that we incorporate 6 key components. And those are an individual assessment. The solopreneur is an individual first. And so understanding individually where they're at, what their needs are, and how that incorporates into their business concept becomes important. The business assessment and being able to provide the ability of the solopreneur to the employer, the ability to have a constant business assessment and approach becomes that much more important for them in this trajectory. And ultimately, the approach should have a goal-setting aspect to it that has actionable steps and metrics, has timelines, and it's accountable and has progress associated with it. And so at the end of the day, technical assistance is really looking at those practitioners, providing that quality service to assist in this transformation, where a nurturing environment allows for the growth of sustainable businesses to become employers and wealth to the community. So that wraps up my start of this session, and I'll be handing things off to Jean, but Sylvia, I hand it off to you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Nestor. That was fantastic. I think people were so riveted. They were just watching and not putting questions in. So, but there was so much in that presentation. I think that, that honestly, I think for a business owner, and I myself as I'm a solopreneur, I think that just, if you look at just the layers and layers of complexity, what you were talking about in terms of opportunities, sales, marketing, it's a lot. And when you're a solopreneur, you're sort of trying to do it all yourself. And I think your point about going from being yourself, doing everything to, and maybe it's doing what you love or what you're good at, to then actually running a business and focusing on the structure of your business and the goals of the business. That's a huge, huge leap. But it is also, as you pointed out, and I think this is the really important thing, it's the way to build wealth. And so when you go from being an extension of a person to actually creating a separate entity and having that ability for permanence, I thought that was great, and really good lesson for everyone here. A couple other things that you pointed out. I mean, the different types of legal structures and kind of what they're capable of, and that the limited liability corporation, S Corp and C Corp are the ones that provide the most, kind of tick all the boxes in terms of the possibility of perpetuity, the liability coverage, that possibility to transfer, sell, be a total separate entity, all the different things, all the different areas where business can fail, which is really real, cash, not having the market, not having a unique product, legal issues, pricing issues, or just the model's not the right model. So, and that all kind of fed into the fact that businesses really do need all sorts of support. So you called insulation, and that there's all sorts of programs out there. And I think that lastly, two last things that to recap some of the nuggets that you left us, the difference between coaching, advising, and consulting. And I think, I thought that was great, just in that businesses need just moral support. They need a champion, not always like advice that's specifically, expertise, because it's not easy doing it. But then they do also need that, that person that's giving them the actual technical expertise, and then somebody who's helping them really with evaluating and advising, and meeting businesses where they are. So, no matter whether that's at the very beginning or whether all of those things that you laid out in this deck are something that someone understands. So I think that was great. I don't know if there are any questions, but it seems like, unless anyone has a burning question right now for Nestor, I think I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jean, and then we'll certainly have room at the end. So Jean, I think it's all yours.
So first of all, I hope you all will treat me with mercy, because I have to follow that kind of brilliance, and I'll do my best. Let me give you just a little bit of context for the presentation I'm going to share with you. First of all, I'm really going to talk about small businesses that are committed to becoming employers and have actually taken the first step. They will have at least one employee. These are the businesses that are at the edge of being a second stage business. And as Nestor pointed out, what I'm trying to show you in this deck is how you meet that kind of business where they are, so they can continue to grow and to create jobs. A little sobering fact came out from the SBA Advocacy Office today on the fact sheet. We have 3.2 million small businesses in the United States. Do you want to guess what percentage of them are employers? Nobody wants to guess?
Yeah, I'll guess 4%.
4%? Other guests? Okay, Evan, Ken, you're just a little too pessimistic. It's 5%. So we're doing better than you expected. So that means that 19% are employers, 5 million of them are employers, 81% are sole employees, are sole proprietors. So I'm going to be talking about that 19%, that 5 million that are the job creators, and how we get more businesses in that group to grow more jobs. The second thing is I'm going to look at this from the landscape that a second stage business moves in. So I'm going to be looking at lending and contracting, and I'm going to be using the language that's part of those domains. And I'll particularly make reference to a lot of that language has been developed by the SBA. So I'm using the vocabulary of that larger practice. And the other is, in terms of my own background, what I'm drawing on is back in 2006, I was part of the team that built the Streetwise MBA, which has been utilized across the country in hundreds of communities to catalyze a local ecosystem around small employer firms by using capacity building as that catalyst. And the curriculum has been taught in Indian country, it's been taught on reservations, it's been in urban settings, it's been in rural settings, it's been in suburban settings, it's been with every kind of group of entrepreneurs would fall under the SBA's definition of minority business enterprises. And no matter what that composition, it works really well. In fact, the businesses that complete the Streetwise MBA during the Great Recession created jobs at 18 times the rate of the private sector as a whole. And 75% of those businesses were either minority owned or located in a low to moderate income community. So these are the businesses that should have really suffered during the Great Recession, and instead they proved themselves to be magnificent job creators. So then drawing on that experience as we talk in this deck to help you think about what you can do in your community. The overarching context is this is very stage specific. It's not for, as Nestor said, it doesn't cover the whole gambit. It's specifically targeted to existing small employer firms, even if they have just one, but have the potential to really grow and be broader employers. So my goal in this is I'm going to assume all of you are tight on money and to really look at how you can catalyze an ecosystem that's going to be, you're going to be by use and do that by focusing on developing a capacity building program for these types of business owners. First of all, we're going to look at ecosystems systemically. Then we're going to look at what does a minority-owned small employer firm ecosystem look like? What does capacity building for these type of employer firms look like? And lastly, I've got a takeaway slide with a lot of free resources that you can use to do this. So let's start with how do we look at ecosystems systemically? First of all, like an onion, a system is a multi-layered entity. The top of the system is the organizational level, and it's where primary focus is. It's where we spend most of our time. It's where you pay consultants a lot of money to come in and give you plans, put in targets, put in measures, and tell you how to make your system work. The mid-level is the interpersonal. And in systems thinking, systems dynamics, to optimize the whole, you have to improve the relationships between the parts. And the interpersonal level of between the people in that ecosystem is often receives very little time and is not considered a priority. It's the organization that they're in that is. But the bit of the iceberg that sank the Titanic was not the top, it was the bottom bit. And the bottom bit in its system is the values and mental models. These are the existing values within the system and within that individuals are holding. There are also values that the group can decide to choose and to which it will hold itself accountable. But it's also what's called a mental model. And this is an unspoken or unrecognized belief that we have about ourselves, each other, and the system. So I always use the example from the work that we did at Enterprise, where I was the CEO, about anchor procurement. And one of the things that surfaced was this mental model that both small business owners and procurement people have, which is if you tell me what to do, I won't do it. And all of a sudden, it became much clearer as to why it was difficult when something was coming from the top of the university down to the procurement officers, why we weren't getting the kind of change we were getting. So the other thing about change in a system is it moves at the speed of trust. And every time you change the system, there is nobody who knows how to do it. It's a brand new experiment because you've got all the different parts of the system you're going to have to be working with. If we knew how to do it, it would already be done, which is what makes it an experiment. And like with any experiment, you have to line up the folks who are going to be working on it so they're embracing the same goal and they're going to learn their way forward together. I put the Martian here because if any of you have seen that, then even though he's on Mars and everybody else is on the Earth, they're all learning their way forward to get this guy back to planet Earth. What it means, we're going to move at the speed of trust, is we're going to have to invest more time on relationships and values. And the way trust gets built when we spend that time, I always call it the power of the nose. I mean, as human beings, we know it. We say something smells rotten here, that we really do have to be nose to nose. We have to be in the same room, in the same space with each other, which right now, because of what we're doing with so much Zoom, makes it a little bit harder. But it's an aspiration to look for. You know, how can you meet outside? But how can you meet with your masks on in a well-ventilated space? But really not defaulting to the screen, but instead finding a space in which you can be nose to nose. Trust is built through questions, because questions create space. They also generate curiosity. So rather than making a declaration, moving into where we're exploring. Again, we go back to an experiment. We have a hypothesis. We have questions. And lastly, trust is built because we inquire, we appreciate, we listen, and we reflect. This is one of the reasons this all takes much more time. It's not about us telling each other. It's about us listening to, reflecting with, and learning with each other. The way you change a system is the system has to work on itself. You can bring in outside people who are going to tell you what to do, but lasting systems change is always because the system has gathered itself together to work on itself. It's important that that gathering occurs within an invitational context rather than an order or an edict, which is one of the reasons why that top-down, the president of the university told me to do this, I'm not going to do it. Doesn't work. But I'll continue to give you an example from the procurement work we did with anchor institutions. We did our invitation around a question, which was, why, despite our best efforts, have we failed to grow both the number and size of contracts going to minority small employers? It was the kind of question that stimulated curiosity. It wasn't judgmental. It was designed to be explored, and it was designed to require more knowledge than just what the procurement or the small business or the capacity builders. It was a question that required the whole ecosystem to be gathering and thinking about it. So this is why thinking about your questions and how you form them and tapping into the power of curiosity to draw people in to want to work with you will both enable a system to work on itself, but it'll also catalyze trust amongst each other. This has to be a shared learning project, and the people who are engaged in it need to understand them as both co-framers of the problem and co-framers of the solution. It's why thinking about a question to start with rather than an answer opens that space for that co-problem solving, co-framing. So this is a very complicated side. I'm not going to reach you through all the steps here, but this is basically a step-by-step for how the ecosystem can gather itself to start to work on this capacity building program for minority small employer firms. I think what's really important from looking at this kind of process is that it's not something a consultant can do for you. In fact, one of the things that's important to surface from the ecosystem is someone who can play the facilitative role of inviting and moving and progressing the process with each other. I always say you're looking for the person who started the farmer's market, who got all those farmers to agree to come. You're looking for a person who organizes a community festival. You're looking for someone who knows how to gather people without having tons of resources, but they gather them because they know how to build relationships with them and they get each other interested in each other. So that's the big takeaway. You'll have this as a reference slide, but for you to be thinking about is who is that kind of person in your community? Who is that kind of person in your existing ecosystem and your existing working group? So let's look at minority small employer firms, their challenges, their opportunities. As I said, in the business life cycle, there's a stage called second stage. And if you Google it, there's all kinds of writing about it. But basically, each stage, as Nestor pointed out, business development needs a specific response that is aligned with that stage. And the growth challenge for a small employer firm is the exact same one for every teenager, which is everything is changing. You usually recognize that you're ready to become a second stage firm because you get stuck. And just like everybody else, when we get stuck in our business, we just do more of what we were doing anyway because it used to work. And that only gets us more stuck and it gets us more buried in the business. So one of the things we used to always ask to help identify firms at this stage was, when was the last time you took a vacation, and who wants to listen to you anymore talk about how hard it is to run your business? And basically, if you haven't had a vacation and people don't want to listen to it anymore, you're probably at the point where you really are stuck and you need to be with other business owners. Another is that business owners at this stage have huge fear of imposter syndrome, that they're going to be found out, that they're going to be told, they think they're faking it. Well, quite frankly, everybody who's a business owner, whoever started anything, faked it, because that's how you get started. So learning to trust themselves and to put aside that fear of the imposter syndrome is a really important step to being able to lead their business in both the evolution of the business itself, but in the evolution of the business owner as well. One of the big markers of this stage is you cannot achieve growth using the same leadership style that you use to start a business. The first leadership style is about control and direction, and it has to be because everything is new, everything is being figured out, and in the end, you own it, you've got to make it happen. But there will come a point where you have to delegate, you have to trust the people you delegate to, and you have to build processes that let you know that things are being done the way you want it to be done. And I say always the indicator of this is when you can go from saying it's my business to you can start to talk about it's our business. And as long as you're saying it's my business, you're still in that control and direction. Growth at this stage is driven by the 4 C's. And the one that is crucial, and Nestor touched on it at the very top of his list, is customers. Minority small employer firms, all small employer firms grow based on sales. Capital supports the sales cycle, but if the customers are not there, they will not grow. And we currently live in an environment where most of the focus has been on capital because it's easy to get out the door and because people can make money off of it. But refocusing back on how do you broaden the customer base, and particularly for businesses like this, how do you move them out of local markets and into regional, national, and international markets is crucial to the continued growth and development. To achieve customers, they have to have capacity. To achieve customers, they have to have connections. And to grease all of this and keeping it working, they have to have access to capital. Sales and expanding markets is the lifeblood, and being able to understand your market, being able to know what your sales cycle looks like, how long it takes something to close, all the rich dynamics that go into designing a sales process. This is the core meat of the change the organization's going through. And lastly, because everything is now so complex and moving so quickly, cash flow management and understanding your financials as more than just a cash budget, but understanding accrual and planning for accrual spend is really going to be crucial. So a minority small employer firm, the profile within this second stage is their revenues on the lower end are a little bit smaller. It's 150K. Actually, if you look at the field as a whole, you're probably starting at about 300K. And their upper revenue levels, about 5 to 7 mil. If we're looking again as the field as a whole, we're probably at 10 to 12. They usually have 2+ employees. Doesn't necessarily mean 3 FTEs, but there may be 2 part-timers, that may be a part-timer and a full-timer, but they've taken that step. They've recognized they have to hire somebody. They've been in business about 3 years, which is one of the reasons why they've been able to take a step and look at hiring. There is a mentality shift that starts for many of these. Many started as an entrepreneur of necessity, and I've referenced on this slide research out of Batson College about entrepreneurs of necessity, and have recognized now they have a lot of opportunity, and so they're evolving into being an entrepreneur of opportunity. Most will still be based in a low wealth community or a minority owned or themselves minority owned. Increasingly, though, we're seeing, if you look at the data, that many of these businesses are expanding beyond just the neighborhoods we normally think of them being in and have a much broader distribution. Their growth is market driven, just like everybody else, and increased sales and expansion beyond their local markets is key to being able to do that. And just like any other business in this stage, the owner is pretty much buried in the business and often highly isolated. We used to have people who finished the Streetwise MBA say, I went from isolation to enterprise. And breaking through that isolation is crucial to them being able to grow, both as a business owner, but also to grow their business. So why existing small employer firms? Because basically, if you want jobs, these are the people who make them. What you see in this little diagram is there comes a point where there's this huge pent-up potential to create jobs in an existing business that's stuck, that once it's unleashed, the jobs take off exponentially. As I said, during the Great Recession, enterprise businesses 18 times the rate of the private sector. In the Streetwise MBA, historically, minority-owned businesses are the greater job creators because they've had more pent-up demand, but they've had more anxiety or less understanding of how they might actually go and hire the people they need to hire. So this point is the inflection point where you're going to get the goal of job creation. Most solopreneurs are not going to want to do this. So you're going to have to figure out, how do you find the ones that do? And one of the reasons you also want to grow these businesses is they become models for solopreneurs. People can see, oh, they did that. How did they do that? And to go back to that point about being coaches, they can support other business owners in learning how to make this transition themselves. But I think an often overlooked factor is as their businesses grow, they become freed in terms of time to actually play a more active role in community and civic leadership and to bring their business sense and business nous to the understanding and framing and solutions of local community problems. Why these firms for us to look at? Well, we're in a low to moderate income, an LMI designated community using US Census data, the majority of sources of major employment are going to be large institutions, anchor institutions, or government agencies in small employer firms. The small employer firms are the only net new job creators. Government agencies and anchor institutions have a fairly stable workforce, but if you want to grow new jobs, these are the people who are going to grow it for you. And in the first 10 years I was at Enterprise, our businesses grew 30,000 net new jobs across the country. And these were majority firms that were from they would have been 20 to 50 by the time they'd finished the survey or had grown over that period of time. Most of them started with us. They were 3 to 4 employees. So this really is a pent-up job creation engine for our communities. They also have the potential to create good jobs with livable salaries and benefits. And this is data, again, from Enterprise, where if you look at the 10-year impact study that we did, these were the businesses that were in the communities they were in, generating the larger salary growth. And almost all of them, 79% of them, were offering benefits as well as good salaries. Their salaries were at or higher than the average salary in their city at that time. They've survived startup, and they have the highest potential for further growth and for and greater resilience. Documentation for this was published by the San Francisco Fed. It's a research initiative that we did coming out of the Great Recession to look at why our businesses were doing so good at creating jobs. And what we learned was a set of management practices and behaviors that they built through the capacity building program, but really came into their own force when the recession hit. And lastly, as I said, they're models for possibilities of growth. So the ecosystem to support the growth of these businesses, there's certain domains. The seed that gets planted and the key to unlocking all of this is business stage appropriate capacity building. As Nestor pointed out, the same thing. What feeds that seed is access to expanded markets. And we firmly believe that learning how to go from being a B2C to a B2B or a B2Gov business is an important part of that expansion. That the most resilient businesses are doing businesses with other businesses or with larger agencies or government entities. That the B2C is often the most fragile businesses that we have. That they've got stage appropriate capital, and that they have access to talent and the resources to grow their talent. So most states have lots of workforce development funds that employers can apply for and use to grow their people. The problem is the amount of paperwork that's needed to get it. Most small employer firms are never able to access it. But we'll look at that in a minute about how an ecosystem can address that. There needs to be a conducive culture to fertilize the seed as it's growing. And that is, if you look at what the culture for high-tech ecosystems, they do a lot of celebrating. They do a lot of promoting. There's visibility, there's recognition, there's engagement. We seldom do that at all for small businesses of any kind, anywhere. But it's really important that there's this, we're glad you're here message that's being heard by the business owners. And then, as Nestor pointed out, the role of government and the numerous things that government can do to also fertilize the growth of this group of businesses is terribly important. And I think I always stretch the customer service mentality that why make it tough? If ever a small business owner says it's hard to do this, you need to look at it just like if you were running a corporation, you need to bring the same frame of customer service, because someone will try something once, they'll try to get to that resource once. If they can't get it, they'll walk away. They just don't have the time. So if we look at this seed, this capacity building program, here are some things I want you to think about including in it. And we're going to start with the challenges and then go over to the components. So the trust deficit and the sense of isolation, which can keep someone paralyzed, is fed by the imposter syndrome. And one of the things that both Nestor and I know from our work is that a peer-to-peer cohort learning model gives people the space to recognize, oh, other people have the same problem, but also to start to move out of isolation. In a capacity building program, it's important, in my opinion, after many years of doing this, that they're studying each other's businesses, partly because this will build a bond that will last for generations. It's also, we stole this idea from Vistage, which is the largest corporate CEO executive program in the world. And studying their own businesses is the secret sauce in the Vistage program. And people at Vistage pay $16,000 a year to do this. But you can design a program where they don't have to pay that and just build that into it. You're doing everything because that's the challenge. You have to shift your leadership style. This is why delivering a program like this using a behavioral education model, where it takes about 9 months to lose a behavior, get a new behavior, and have that behavior installed, which means that you're not going to slip back. So having the program needs to be long enough and to meet frequently enough so that new habits can be formed and kept. And the instructional model needs to be facilitative so that the business owners are actually coming in, they're participating, they have to come prepared. They can't just sit there and be talked at. I always say this is the Weight Watchers meets the MBA model, that if you've ever tried to lose weight and keep it off, you know this, right? I got told that wasn't a nice thing to say, but I've said it again. Market and employee expansion is really important. And when, where, and how to do both is what needs to be learned. And that's why choosing a stage-appropriate business curriculum that ends in a growth plan is really important for this category of business owner at this stage in their development. And we'll talk about one in a minute that's totally free and comes in multiple languages and has been tested over time. Bridging social capital is the connections that they need to build across the ecosystem domains. And this is where one of the reasons you want that growth plan is because you can start to enlist others in aspects of the domains to provide advice, to provide guidance, to provide coaching, to be there. You can make an event out of having those growth plans presented. You can give people a chance to have feedback. You can make it something where their families, their communities, their customers come to. That culminating plan as a tool is a very valuable way in which to build bridging social capital. And lastly, you need to think about this challenge of stage appropriate capital and access to larger contracts. And that means delivering your program in such a way that integrated into its content is relationship building with members of the domains that relate to those two areas. Don't have them come in and say, this is my job, this is what I do, but instead bring them in to problem solve mutually with a group of small business owners. This is where, again, where you can go back to the live case method. You want them there learning with, thinking with, and guiding and being part, getting emotionally invested in the success of the businesses. We used to regularly advise our instructors to invite the head of procurement for the state, because a state buys everything, just like the federal government. And we would have this person come in, and literally every business in the cohort of 15 to 20 businesses, they came prepped to say, here's how the state can do business with you. So businesses that thought they would never do contracting were all of a sudden, they had the person in front of them who could certify them. They also had the person who had the relationship that could open the door. So in an ecosystem, you have domains. We go back to seed, feed, and fertilize. And an important part of your work as you're thinking about working in an ecosystem approach is you have to fill in the actor map around those different domains. And I've put some here, and I've put some potential folks who would be in it. In all of your communities, it's going to be different. And on the slide with the resources, I'll give you some links for free ways to learn how to do actor maps. And I always put question marks because you never know. This is kind of the standard package, but in your community, there may be something new. And if you've got that domain with the question mark, you're looking for that. You're thinking about who else might be there. What have we missed? What might go there? And one of the things when you do an actor map, you also want to understand what resources can each of these members of the domain. And when you populate it, you don't just put the organization, you actually put people's names and indicate what kind of resources they control and on a measure of how much power to make a decision they have. So let's look at this suggested capacity building model. I've come back to trust because speed moves at the speed of trust, and trust is really this trust gap is all over this work. And if we start with that trust deficit that the owner has in themselves, but also that others have in them, we start to get this cycle where the business owner is doing everything. They've limited access because they have no time to figure out how to go get funding, because often how to get the funding is not just about applying for funding, it's about building relationships. They're unable or unwilling to think about how to engage in larger markets. It's frightening. How am I going to do it? Who am I going to do it with? They may not know anybody who's ever done it, so maybe it's not for them. They have an employee gap. They're reluctant they need employees, but they're reluctant to hire them because they don't know how, they don't know where to go get them. They're worried that if they hire them, they're going to get it wrong. So again, they're not trusting themselves. And lastly, because of this all together, they're isolated. They have little bridging capital and little social capital. So this kind of program starts with build the trust. And this is a draft model using the Fast Track Growth Venture curriculum, which you can download for free with all the teaching aids from Kauffman Foundation, 3 different languages. It can be taught easily over 9 months on a part-time basis, 100 hours over that 9 months. You can easily break it into 10 3-hour biweekly sessions with prep time. It lends itself to a live case model. You can use it and build around it smaller CEO support groups, which are incredibly important. That one, it's where they will do their prep work. They'll meet up with each other to do it initially. So it builds personal and group accountability. What this group is actually, it's the beginning of their first ever advisory board. And they get used to listening to someone else say to them, which they would never let anybody do any other time, you should be thinking about doing this with your business, or have you looked at that? And all of a sudden they become less controlling and they start to be more open because they're part of a small group of peers working together over time and building that trust. It's really important that you use a facilitative instructor, not a teacher. These are adult learners. These are not college students or college professors, the kiss of death. I'll tell you right now, you need someone who's going to have credibility with a business owner, which means they have to have grown a business. And you want past experience facilitating adult learning. It's also important that this instructor has an understanding of the cultural context of your business owners, because the curriculum is stage appropriate, and that's what it needs to be, but the instructor needs to be context appropriate. And this is how, when we did this with in Indian country, we recruited Native American instructors, and then we had a couple of places where we had to use instructors who weren't Native American because we just couldn't find anyone. Well, we had those Native American instructors coaching those other instructors to make sure that they were aware of and comfortable with the context. The adult learning cycle is share, learn, plan, execute, and reflect, and then repeat it and do it all over again. So it's called iterative learning, and that's built into how the facilitator works. And then this is where I show my age. It's important that one of the things that a business gets through this kind of program is what I call the instant Rolodex for growth. They come in with the Rolodex they started their business with, but they need the Rolodex, I can't remember what the contemporary phrase would be, that they're going to need to grow their business. Like I said, it's important to have a visible output, which is this growth plan, and that it's used to create celebration and connection. But most important is the outcome, which this type of model means that these businesses are acquiring business knowledge, they're accessing know-how, and know-how sits in people. It's in the members of their cohort, it's in the members of the ecosystem that will be invited into the classroom, it's in the instructor themselves, and know-how, you can't go and get it, you learn it from other people. And then they have relationships for further growth. They've left being isolated to being connected. So this is a quick flash on the instant Rolodex of growth. On the left is the areas of external expertise. On the right is the need, and in the middle, with far too many words, are where in the ecosystem you might source these folks. I want to draw your attention particularly to the business reference librarian. One of the toughest things for a business at this stage to do is market research. Every business library in the country, every major reference library has free subscriptions to the tools that a business owner needs to run the data to help them identify what their larger market is. Reference librarians like nothing more than being asked, can you help me? And often they will do it for you. So integrating your business reference librarian, either from your public library system, a university library system, or finding one that's down the road that'll come, be part of this, is a crucial resource. And it's the one that I love it when you introduce the businesses to them. They're all like, why didn't I think of that? It's nobody in the internet age ever thinks about a reference librarian. So this is one of those stimulate curiosity ahas. The other is business school students, because a business school student needs to learn how. They need access to know-how. And by being able to build partnerships with business schools, one of the things an example from our work in Detroit was, how do you access all those free state funds for workforce development? Well, when we were working as an ecosystem group on this question of workforce development, it became quite clear that, business school students need to know how to do this when they start working in business. Let's have them do this. And all the paperwork, all the reporting was now something that was done through one of the business advisors at the business school. And the small business owners worked together and worked with them to put their submissions in and to get those kinds of resources. So you wouldn't normally necessarily think about the reference librarian and the business school students as part of this ecosystem, but I just challenge you to think about that. So these are all free online resources. Strategic doing is a tool for facilitating local and ecosystem collaboration. Forward Cities, which does minority ecosystem work across the country, uses this approach. Quite a few other groups that have been using it. This article from HBR, Harvard Business Review, on the stages of business growth is very easy to follow and is a really good tool as you're talking to people, as you're building your team that's going to work together. I talked about growth venture. If you have businesses that at an earlier stage, they actually have an earlier stage targeted curriculum as well that's also available in multiple languages. This is the research from the San Francisco Fed on small firm resilience that I made reference to. And the last four are tools that show you how to do actor mapping and what information you need and how to do it. And that's what I've got for you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jean. That there was so much rich material in there. And just to recap for everybody, I think, you highlighted really nicely how the ecosystem, that this is really a systems change and the importance of mental models. And Megan, thanks, Megan Briggs, for dropping a really great link in the chat. If you guys didn't see it, there's a great model there, or visual. But I had a boss used to say, put the R before the I, put the relationship, work the relationship before working the issue. And I've kept that in my head forever. But I think, that you really got to the idea of trust and the importance of trust. And then I think the profile that you provided and the characteristics of a second stage business when a business is ready, and really the fact that you have to sort of feel some discomfort and some pain to get to growth. And that these entrepreneurs are feeling discomfort. They're feeling stuck. They're kind of that is sort of the place in which they recognize something needs to change, but they may not know how to do it. And that's really the time to come in and intervene and help them and shift their, I think what you brought up about shifting their leadership style from control and direction to delegation, trust, and process. But that in itself is a process, and that there's a certain amount of time, and you mentioned 9 months to really solidify those habits and not slip back into that control mode. I think that'll be really helpful to everyone here who's working on programs.
I should say they will slip back. They always do. But now that they've been through it, you can hold them accountable to the fact they said they didn't want to slip back.
Right.
But if you've lost weight, we've all put it back on. It's the same thing, but
Yep.
it's creating a climate of accountability in the relationships.
Yeah, no, thanks for highlighting that. And then I think lastly, so this is an inflection point. This is a point when businesses can kind of get to that catalyst and start, growing very quickly and creating jobs. And that this is, this gets to the wealth creation point. This is where these entrepreneurs can almost step back and their business works for them and do other things. And then there's others that are earning and growing within that business. And the fact that, minority-owned small employers are the ones that can create really good jobs and more opportunities, and some of the better opportunities is a great reminder. So there were a couple questions, and I'm going to make sure everybody has time as well. And you can just raise your virtual hand in the chat. But there was one question from Tim Senior about what if there is very little existing trust in the ecosystem? So Jean, that's one for you.
So my wicket past, which you may hear in my accent, is I worked for a number of years in Belfast, Northern Ireland during the height of the paramilitary activity when people were shooting and killing each other. I've had to dive under a table in the pub as the bomb went off in the street. And it was an environment where there was very little trust and a lot of fear. And the way trust I observed and learned in that context is that trust gets built when one person says to another person, I want to get to know you. And those two people then identify a couple of more people and they go and have a conversation. And it's really important that those conversations are occurring with people you would not normally. So you have to kind of, get yourself ready to go and do it. But you start by tell me your story. What's happening for you in this context? And that was my job. I worked with Protestant paramilitaries who had spent time in prison, had been released, and were working to reintegrate themselves back into their community. And I'm kind of old school, but I'm also a hillbilly from West Virginia. And I just think it all comes down to having the courage to talk to someone and listen to someone whose story is different, and to not worry about doing it at scale or doing it to targets, but just to start. I think it's another way you build trust in a system is you start by trying to learn something together. Part of my Wicked Past was also about working with public housing in the UK and understanding the role of festivals, building the environment through the engagement of artists, and bringing people together who would never have been together, but to learn something and to make something together. So and I think the other thing which I've learned is to actually say, there's not a lot of trust here. Is that the way we want it? Is there something more we want with each other? Is this how we want to be with each other? And if it's not, how do we start? It's not, it begins with questions. Questions make that space possible, in my experience. It may be different in other people's experience.
And I'm going to go a step further and piggyback off of what Jean had said, and some of the some of the previous ROC cohorts experienced that, and we brought it to the table in the TA sessions that, they were like, hey, like first and foremost, like our ecosystem, like there's no anchor. Like there's no one that we could really trust to be able to take this forward, if you will. And so one of the things that I would say, I talked about advocacy and empowerment. Get empowered, feel empowered to be able to say, something, if the trust doesn't exist in the ecosystem, become that anchor, become that trust point, right? First and foremost. And then I look at further example, for example, in Philadelphia, all the diverse chambers actually formed a coalition for the first time with an MOU, like-minded groups that at the end of the day have common goals, may not all get there or want to get there the same way, but have common goals. Right?
Yep.
And, those are ways that we may not find those anchors. We may not find that trust source that we can but we create it. Feel empowered to create it. Feel empowered to look at the like-minded organizations within that you can say, something, maybe a loose coalition to start, nurture it, so that then we can look at policy improvement.
I would really urge you to look at the strategic doing model, because it's designed not to come up with a plan and goals, anything. It's literally to have a vision of what we hope we can achieve. And then people break into groups that identify a small step they can take. And the criteria is you don't have to ask permission, and you only have the resources in your group to make it happen. Mm-hmm. And you go and do it. And then the little groups all get back together and they celebrate and they learn, and then they do the next little step. And what's interesting is the folks in Danville, who were in the last ROC group, have been using that approach, have been using that tool. Forward Cities, again, Faye Howitt, who's the CEO there, is just mad keen on this way of doing it. Because as Nestor said, you don't have to ask permission. It gives you the power, whoever many of you there are, to do what you can do and then to build over time off of that.
That's great. Thank you, guys. And I think just to add to that, sometimes there's like-minded organizations that don't join together because they feel like they're competitors and can't be collaborators. So I think, the other element is acknowledging that and figuring out, well, we all have a common interest. How do we collaborate or how do you all collaborate? There was one other question I want to make sure we get to that was from Beth Comers, saying that social capital is built on a white paradigm. How do we get further upstream? And I don't know if Beth, if you want to add any color to that question. Well, I guess I'll let you guys can answer.
My internet is a little, what's that?
No, sorry. Go ahead, Beth.
No, I was just going to say, and this might be a really cynical perspective, but it seems like part of what we're learning to do is to teach entrepreneurs how to play the game, so to speak, the game that has kind of been defined and the rules have been played out based on this white paradigm and this history in America and blah, 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 right? But I actually want to disrupt the game, and I want to rewrite the rules of the game. And I might be a little radical for this group, but it just seems like a lot of what we're talking about is just teach them the rules. But all of those rules are built on how white folks have gotten ahead and what white folks expect. And like social capital, it's all the same. Does that make sense?
So
sorry, we just have 1 minute left. I'm just giving the 1 minute warning.
Okay. I just put the name Glenn C. Lowry in the link. He's the African-American economist who first coined social capital, and Putnam credits him for the idea. I'm also a hillbilly from West by God, Virginia, which means I grew up in coal mining country, and social capital was at the heart of the American Union movement. It doesn't matter what color you are. If you're in the union, you're there to do something with and for each other. And when I use social capital, that's what I'm not talking about that we're going to be co-opted because we're figuring out together how to make a place for each other in a system we may not want, but we're not going to change it if we're not doing it together.
And I would just add to that, you hit something that's a great point. One of the things that for us is very important is to really look at the connectors, right? To make the transformation. Once the connector and transformation is available in that bridge, then we're able to extract a lot better and being able to empower within new arteries being created. And so those are the things that today we currently we try to do as an organization, for example, with the Greater Philadelphia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, is be intentional about connectors to create new arteries.
All right. I'm going to thank you guys. And thank you for that question, Beth. I'm going to hand it over to Sloan to quickly close us out. And I'm sure these types of conversations can continue with some of the TA as well.
Yeah, great point. And just want to say thank you, Jean and Nestor, for fantastic presentations. And I know we're running a little bit over, so please feel free to drop a note that you will get this recording. And the slides will be shared with you just as soon as the recording's uploaded into our system. So thank you all. I hope you all have a fantastic weekend, and we'll definitely be in touch.